Hello, everybody.
Hello.
This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and I'm here with my good friend, Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Yes, happy to be here.
And happy you are here, Dee. And I have a number of interesting topics for us tonight. Uh, there are basically four topics. The first is consideration of the original uh, JCPOA. Uh, okay, consideration of that treaty uh, and how good it was or how bad it was, depending on your point of view. Uh, and our second topic is inching towards a deal. That refers to the United States and Iran slowly inching towards another deal. The third topic is the real goals of Trump with respect to his tariffs. And the fourth is the nature of the smackdown by China, the smackdown of his tariffs by China. Of course, it's
Uh,
already looked like he's lost the trade war,
yes, it does.
but we'll be talking about that during the show. So I guess we'll start off in the usual way
Yes, we will share.
by sharing on Facebook. And I hope those of you who are here will share as well.
Yes, as we always say, sharing is caring, right?
Yes, and caring is sharing.
Absolutely.
It's reciprocal.
Yes. Yeah, because we know how Facebook is. Well, YouTube, everybody else. You gotta let everybody know we're live.
Yes, because Facebook doesn't tell anybody.
Right. It's kind of weird how it doesn't do that, but it is what it is.
Right. Certainly is what it is. Yeah, that's the motto of the realist. The world is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go.
There we go. Sharing and sharing and sharing.
We're going to start off the show. Oh, look, we have Earl of Laurel is here.
Hello, Earl.
Steve Wolfbrand is here. He says, hi, everybody. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hi, Steve.
And we'll start the show with a terrific piece by Mike Whitney, who argues that the original JCPOA, uh, was really a wonderful deal. And the title of his article is The Treaty Trump called, quote, the worst deal in history, unquote, was the most wide ranging and stringent nuclear agreement of all time. So not only wasn't it the worst deal in history, but it was the best deal in history of its kind.
Right.
Mike is going to argue that in this piece. He starts off with a cartoon. 2018, the worst deal ever negotiated, Obama deal. And then there is another picture on your right that says 2025, the greatest deal ever negotiated, Obama 2.0, Trump. So I think Mike thinks we're going to hear about that soon. But anyway, he starts off. The treaty that the United States and Iran signed in July 2015 was the most exhaustive and stringent nuclear agreement in history. No other nuclear treaty comes close. The so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, imposed the most rigorous and extensive verification measures and restrictions of any treaty ever. In terms of scope, enforcement, and duration, it was the toughest of all time, hands down. The strict control on Iran's nuclear program ensured that Iran would not be able to divert nuclear material to a weapons program.
Hmm.
In short, the deal made it impossible for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, which was the stated goal of the agreement and the primary reason for U.S. involvement. But on May 8, 2018, President Trump withdrew from the treaty without consulting Congress or U.S. allies, putting the U.S. in material breach of its obligations under the terms of the agreement. Also, he reimposed unilateral sanctions on Iran, despite the fact that Iran had already shipped 25,000 pounds of enriched uranium out of the country, dismantled and removed 2/3 of its centrifuges, removed the calandria from its heavy water reactor and filled it with concrete, and provided unprecedented access to its nuclear facilities and supply chain. In every way, shape, and form, Iran had complied with the, quote, letter of the law and fulfilled its obligations under the terms of this odious agreement. And yet Trump saw fit to consign it to the dustbin with the wave of the hand. This is the story that Western media will never tell its readers. Well, we're Western media here, and we're telling our readers, or at least we're telling our viewers. The treaty featured stricter requirements on uranium enrichment limits, sharp reductions in the stockpile of low enriched uranium, sharp reduction in the number of centrifuges that were allowed, new and onerous restrictions on underground facilities and research sites, complete termination of plutonium production, and a total ban on the building of heavy water reactors. Further, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, was given access to Iran's entire nuclear supply chain, including uranium mines, centrifuge production, and undeclared sites. Iran also willingly submitted to continuous monitoring that allowed 24/7 inspections of declared facilities, quote, challenge inspections, unquote, that allowed the IAEA access to suspicious sites, and humiliating additional protocols that imposed special transparency measures that were never imposed on any other country in any other treaty. In every way, the JCPOA was the, quote, gold standard, unquote, of nuclear treaties, which means under its provisions, one could be 100% certain that Iran would never build a nuclear weapon. That means that under the terms of the JCPOA, the world could be 100% certain that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. So what part of this agreement sounds like the, quote, worst deal in history, unquote? And the next section is headed Trump envoy reverses course, says Iran nuclear deal must have enrichment shutdown. Yes, he did reverse course, but then he reversed it again. But Steve Witkoff had suggested Monday night that Iran could keep civilian grade facilities in any revised nuclear deal. Trump has never been asked, nor would he be able to answer it. If he was honest, however, he would admit that he withdrew from the treaty, not due to anything Iran had done. Iran remained in strict compliance throughout, but because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saw the treaty as an obstacle to his regime change plans for Tehran. As many people have come to realize, Israel aspires to become the regional hegemon, which means that the economic strangulation of Iran must persist, until which time Bibi can goad Trump into launching decapitation strikes on Iran. That is the ultimate strategic objective, to obliterate Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Just as Israel-US have obliterated Libya, Iran, Syria, and now also Lebanon. Iran looms as the last great obstacle to Israel's ambitious plan to rule the Middle East. Well, I don't know if I would quite say that. There's still Houthis, and Iraq has now come back
Mm-hmm.
with a considerable resistance. And I'm not sure Lebanon is done either.
Oh no, they're not done.
It's worth noting that the JCPOA was endorsed by UN Security Council Resolution 2231, making it part of international law. While not a binding treaty, Trump's unilateral withdrawal and reimposition of sanctions clearly violated the resolution's call for all states to support the deal. There are a number of scholars who have argued that Trump's action undermined the principle of pacta sunt servanda. Specifically, agreements must be kept. By the way, all of the other signatories, UK, France, Russia, China, Germany, and the EU, held up their end of the bargain and honored the agreement, but not the United States. Because the United States does not keep its word when it chooses not to do so, rules, restrictions, treaties, and laws do not apply to the United States. The point we are making, Mike Whitney says, is that Iran acted honorably and fulfilled its obligations while the United States impulsively shrugged off its commitments
That's
and behaved like a petulant child. And that is why the Iranian negotiators refuse to even sit in the same room with the U.S. negotiators. We should point out, however, that even on this seemingly trivial matter, Trump finds it impossible to tell the truth. He continues to insist the two teams are conducting direct, quote, talks, unquote, when he knows for a fact they are in separate rooms shuttling handwritten messages back and forth. This pattern of compulsive deception, even on the most insignificant of issues, is not normal. It's a type of psychological disorder. Here's an excerpt from an article at Press TV, which is an Iranian publication that is 1,000 times more reliable than CNN. Trump famously referred to the 2015 nuclear agreement as, quote, the worst deal in history, unquote.
I remember that too.
Me too. And promised to strike a, quote, better deal, unquote, that would also address other issues such as the Islamic Republic's ballistic missile program and regional activities, issues that Iran had called its red lines. In pulling out of the deal, the U.S. president initiated what he called a, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, campaign aimed at compelling Iran to renegotiate a new deal. All the other parties to the deal, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, expressed regret over the U.S. decision and pledged to uphold the agreement. And that last quote is from a piece known as Analysis. As indirect nuclear talks resume in Rome, why is Iran distrustful of the U.S.? And that piece is from Press TV.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. Trump pulled out of the most far-reaching and stringent nuclear treaty in history, not because Iran broke the rules, but because he was acting as an agent for Israel. He wanted to use the sanctions as a means of coercing Iran into abandoning its friends, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and giving up the weapons, ballistic missiles, it needs to defend itself against the impending U.S.-Israel military attack. Naturally, from Israel's point of view, this makes perfect sense, while from Iran's perspective, it is tantamount to national suicide. Iran would have to be, quote, barking mad, unquote, to dismantle the strategic missile program at the precise time that Israel has lost all grip on reality and is rampaging across the region like Attila the Hun.
Mm-hmm.
Here's more, and that is the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, peaceful-looking man with a nice little smile on his face.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever Trump's true motives, okay, this is a quote also, one fact remains indisputable. The U.S. abandoned the JCPOA despite the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, reportedly confirming Iran's full compliance with its nuclear obligation. The UN nuclear agency responsible for monitoring nuclear programs had issued 15 reports verifying that Iran was adhering to the terms of the agreement, including limitations on uranium enrichment and reductions in its nuclear stockpile.
Mm-hmm.
It had confirmed that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile and heavy water reserves remain within the specified limits, noting that Iran had not exceeded the agreed-upon limits on key nuclear activities and had provided inspectors with access to all necessary sites. This is also from Analysis. As indirect nuclear talks resume in Rome, why is Iran distrustful of the U.S.? Repeat, says Mike, 15 reports verifying Iran was adhering to the terms of the agreement. The average American would never sit down and negotiate with someone who had repeatedly stabbed him in the back and, quote, screwed him over, unquote.
That's true.
Absolutely true. But once again, Iran has expressed its willingness to engage the U.S. in negotiations despite Washington's abysmal track record. And while we applaud their perseverance, we question their judgment. Here's more. Signed in 2015 under President Barack Obama, the JCPOA was initially hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. But while Iran swiftly and fully implemented commitments, the United States failed to hold up its end of the bargain from the very beginning. Sanctions were supposed to be lifted on implementation day, January 16, 2016, once the IAEA confirmed Iran's compliance. But the U.S. Treasury imposed new sanctions the very next day. targeting individuals and entities connected to Iran's missile program, even though missiles were not prohibited under the JCPOA or even U.S. Security Council Resolution 2231. Throughout 2016, Washington continued to apply pressure tactics. Iran, for example, was only granted partial permission to purchase commercial aircraft after months of delay and a formal warning that it would invoke the JCPOA's dispute resolution mechanism. That's abbreviated DRM. 117 Airbus aircraft Iran ordered, only 3 were delivered. None of the Boeing planes it ordered ever arrived. In a more serious brief, U.S. Congress passed a 10-year extension of the Iran Sanctions Act in December 2016. That's also from the article from Press TV called Analysis as Indirect Nuclear Talks Resume in Rome. Why is Iran distrustful of the United States? Fair-minded Americans who have followed events in the Middle East closely are probably not surprised at the dismal way that Iran has been treated. Even so, it's shocking to see that the, quote, U.S. Treasury imposed new sanctions the very next day, unquote. That's got to be some kind of record. In other words, the ink on the treaty was still wet when double-dealing Obama went back on his word and violated the agreement. Here's more. He noticed the map. There's Azerbaijan, Iran, also Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, there, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Witkoff tweets, a deal with Iran will only be completed if it is a Trump deal. Any final agreement must set a framework for peace, stability, and prosperity in the Middle East, meaning that Iran must stop and eliminate its nuclear enrichment and weaponization program. It is imperative for the world that create a tough, fair deal that will endure, and that is what President Trump has asked me to do. And this is from Ambassador Witkoff. He tweeted this on April 15th, 2025. Under Obama, the U.S. approach to the JCPOA was marked by delays, loopholes, and politically calculated half measures. The agreement may have represented a breakthrough on paper, but Washington's failure to deliver meaningful economic relief signaled early on that the U.S. could not be counted on to uphold its commitments, even when diplomacy was supposedly in full swing. Fast forward to 2025, when Trump, upon returning to the White House, swiftly reinstated his, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, campaign against Iran. In a development that underscored the contradictions of Washington's approach, Trump sent a letter to Ayatollah Khamenei expressing willingness to reach a deal while threatening Iran with military action if no agreement is reached. The move is widely viewed in Tehran as another attempt to create the illusion of diplomacy while intensifying sanctions and threats on the ground. For Iranian officials, it serves as further proof of the U.S. pattern: hostile actions cloaked in the language of outreach. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi emphasized that Tehran is open to negotiations, but not under coercive tactics, stating that talks under, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, equate to surrender. In his February 7th speech, Ayatollah Khamenei pointed out that the JCPOA, which was the result of 2 years of intense negotiations, was torn up under Trump's first term, asserting that to negotiate with such an administration is not wise, smart, and honorable, unquote. Quote, we negotiated, we gave concessions, and we made compromises, but we didn't attain the intended result, unquote. He said, referring to the talks that resulted in the 2015 deal. Quote, we must learn from this experience. That also is from the analysis article I've been quoting from continuously. One cannot help but wonder, is Iran just wasting its time dealing with Trump? Wouldn't it be wiser to simply end this farce and go back to building more missiles? What's clear is that this has nothing to do with nuclear programs, nuclear enrichment, or nuclear proliferation. It's all a diversion aimed at stripping Iran of its critical weapon systems, ballistic missiles, so it's unable to defend itself against an Israeli-U.S. attack. The real goal is to plunge Iran into the
Hmm. You okay, Joe?
Yep.
Okay.
What's clear is that none of this has anything to do with nuclear programs, nuclear enrichment, or nuclear proliferation. It's all a diversion aimed at stripping Iran of its critical weapons systems, specifically ballistic missiles, so it's unable to defend itself against an Israeli-U.S. attack. The real goal is to plunge Iran into the same chaotic misery as Libya, Syria, and Iraq, all of whom have been deliberately annihilated so Israel can emerge as the preeminent regional power. Here's a graphic on the development of Iran's uranium stockpile. Obama becomes president, and Iran agreed
Iran agreed.
to cap its stockpile at 300 kilograms in 2015, but abandoned this when the U.S. left the JCPOA. So you can see, at the beginning here, that in 2008, actually 2009, when Obama became the president, the stockpile was very small, maybe 1,000 kilograms. Then it started going up and up, and up. And then there was an agreement in 2015, and the stockpile, in accordance with the agreement, was abandoned by Iran and went down to virtually zero. Then Trump became the U.S. president. The stockpile remained at zero until 2018, and the U.S. left the JCPOA. Then Iran started once again building the stockpile up from zero. And now, by 2022, it had 2,883 kilograms, nowhere near the roughly 8,300 kilograms that it had at the time of the JCPOA agreement. So, presumably by this time, in 2025, it probably doesn't have a stockpile as large as what it had in 2015.
And the one thing too, when it comes to keeping agreements and all, Israel doesn't keep agreements at all.
Israel doesn't keep agreements at all either. Neither the United States nor Israel, both of our countries, are lawless. I'm ashamed to say.
Right, and then the U.S. gets on everybody else.
So the reason why we're covering this article tonight is because we want to give you context, important context about the original deal, the breaching of the deal, what's happened to the uranium stockpile, how it was completely abandoned by Iran and now is built up again, but probably nowhere near the 8,300 kilograms it had even now.
Right.
But let's check out your comments on this first post. Everybody says hi. Steve, Dawn Foster, Evelina, the Earl of Laurel, and Steve Wolfgren. Everybody says hi.
That's good. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. We'll move now to our second article, which is a piece by Larry Johnson. It's on the same topic, basically.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's on the second topic of tonight, which is U.S. inching towards a deal with Iran.
I hope so.
And this is Larry Johnson's blog on April 19, 2025.
Okay.
Take it away, Dee.
Okay. Okay. Let me just get this a little larger over here, my end.
Okay.
I don't know why this thing is on my page. 1 second. Okay. Donald Trump's envoy leading the negotiations with Iran, Mr. Steve Witkoff, is behaving like an Olympic gymnastics gold medalist, performing an amazing series of verbal backflips. A week ago, he appeared prepared to accept a cap on Iranian uranium enrichment. Then, by midweek, he put out a message on social media insisting that Iran had to give up all uranium enrichment. And today, based on comments from the Iranian negotiators, Witkoff apparently did another volte-face. The two sides agreed to appoint experts who could hammer out the details of an agreement that would allow Iran to continue with the peaceful use of nuclear energy while providing for inspections that would guarantee Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. I don't know about you, but I breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing that news. We may get out of this alive if the announced plans for future meetings stay on track. Iran's foreign minister delivered an upbeat report on today's meeting in Rome. According to Agashi, the second round of talks was once again constructive, and if the Americans continue to present realistic demands and good faith, an agreement is within reach. Talks between nuclear experts of our countries, the U.S. and Iran, will begin on Wednesday in Oman, and on Saturday we will have the third round of talks, also in Oman, which will discuss the findings of the experts. In case of any nuclear deal, it will be monitored by the IAEA, and no external party, including the United States, will be involved in the monitoring our nuclear program. Netanyahu and the Zionist lobby in the United States will be furious about this news. I don't doubt they will pull every lever possible to try to derail these negotiations. But Trump is desperate for a foreign policy victory. He's failed to deliver on his promise to end the war in Ukraine and is facing growing pressure from angry farmers who are outraged over the tariff war on China. So, if he can bring home a win by declaring that Iran is ending its program to build a nuke, even if it means accepting an updated version of the JCPOA deal he, Trump, abandoned 7 years ago. I think he will stick with the deal Witkoff appears to have concluded with Foreign Minister Argashi. There are other factors that may be giving Trump second thoughts about starting a war with Iran. The Middle East Spectator is reporting that Iran's 2,000-kilometer range Sefer-Oth radar has finally become operational. Satellite imagery seems to confirm.
Okay, I should add here, the OTH, okay, is over the horizon radar. Okay,
Okay.
that's what it stands for. Okay, please go on.
The radar array is one of Iran's most advanced over-the-horizon radars, more than 1.5 kilometers in length. It can detect takeoffs of individual aircraft or ballistic missile launches at a range of up to 2,000 kilometers, including inside the entirety of Israel. Only a handful of countries have mastered such advanced OTH radar technology, and the radar provides Iran with valuable early warning of an imminent attack. If the U.S. intelligence community is confirming this report, then I believe that Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth are telling Trump that the Iranians have the capacity to detect and thwart a military attack by either the U.S. or Israel. At least I hope that is what is happening behind closed doors. We also cannot ignore what Vladimir Putin is doing behind the scenes, most likely in concert with Xi Jinping, to help shape the deal between the U.S. and Iran by assuring Donald J. Trump that Russia is fully committed to preventing Iran from the building and using a nuclear weapon. The odd man out is Bibi Netanyahu. If you have not subscribed to Alastair Crooks' terrific Substack Conflicts Forum, I encourage you to do so. At least once a week, Alastair's incredible wife peruses the Hebrew language press in Israel and provides a summary of what the Israelis are saying in their own tongue. Much of this is never reported in the Western press. The most recent post on this subject paints a pretty bleak picture of the internal politics of Israel, based on what is being written and said in Hebrew. Bibi has some big problems. Battle for control of Israel's security agencies escalates, approaching breaking point. Protest movement surges, spreads to Israel's military and intelligence services. 60% of Israelis see a real danger of civil war. Bibi's panic level is rising. He fears mass protests and demonstrations more than anything. And senior defense establishment figures, quote, "We have no idea where the war is going." Speaking of Alastair, I snagged him for another Stella interview this week. It was posted today on the Courier Current.
The countercurrents.
Okay, enjoy.
Okay, and that's the end of this particular post. One significant thing about this post is it represents a change, okay, in Larry Johnson's, okay, in his assessments of the possibility of it, concluding a successful agreement. Uh, he used to be pretty negative on the possibility, but here, okay, he is clearly hopeful that we may be able to get out of this alive.
Hmm.
if the announced plans for future meetings stay on track. This is a change in his thinking. Okay, now today he had another video. I don't give a link to it here. Okay, but he had another video today. It was also on countercurrents. Okay, and in that video, he was also hopeful that it might be possible to pull an agreement together. Okay, I think Alistair Crook remains perhaps more skeptical about the possibility of agreement than Larry Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
This was somewhat clear from an interview that Alistair did on the Judging Freedom show on Monday morning. First thing, okay, Monday morning. I'm going to pick up the interview about 5 minutes in. The first 5 minutes was on the death of the Pope, and just some, back and forth on, the death of the Pope. So I'm going to start the interview at 5 minutes in. I'm sharing it now.
Three woes confronting Donald Trump in the spring of 2025.
That's a little
And you,
okay.
You have articulated three woes confronting Donald Trump in the spring of 2025. And you articulate them as the deep state, the Israel lobby, and the debt bomb. Let's start with the debt bomb, because if they don't address this, they're not going to have the cash with which to fight their wars. What is the debt bomb? Do we have $9 trillion in debt that needs either to be paid or rolled over?
Gabapentin is bringing you closer to amputation. These are three symptoms that are signaling that you could be close.
In the next year?
A little bit more than 9 trillion. This was really, if you like, Yellen's sort of tripwire that she left for President Trump when she left the office of Treasury Secretary. She has spent this last period turning over American debt on very short-term paper. I mean, not even a proper bond, not a 3 or 5 year, but literally, month-long bond. And so this has been accumulating. And now there is a large wad of debt that needs to be rolled over quite soon. And of course, it needs to be rolled over into longer term maturities and also higher interest rates, inevitably. Already the interest rates on American debt is now running at over $1 trillion a year. And that's likely to go up as interest rates go up. So this is going to be, and the danger is that the sort of bulk of this has to be done just before the midterm elections. So we could expect that the 26 midterm elections in America. So we could expect that the turbulence and that the weakness in the bond market will continue. And why I think it's so existential for him is we've seen that this turbulence continues and is really serious, because it could be like 2008, where you have, there's already been rumors, you have one big player, one hedge fund or something, that has made a bet on interest rates or taken a position, highly leveraged, and leveraged the other side with futures. It isn't paying off, and they're having to sell a lot of good assets to pay off their leverage on these debts. And that these things, once people start not to believe in the collateral people or hedge funds or banks are putting down, it spreads very quickly and the thing can actually freeze up and no liquidity can happen. And then suddenly you get in a situation where for certain types of paper there is just no bid, no
Mm.
one bidding at all.
I-
Then you're
I-
in a big crisis.
Okay, let me talk about the debt bomb, so-called. Now, I haven't kept track of what, Secretary Yellen was doing, but what Alistair tells us is that she was rolling over debt by selling a lot of short-term debt. 3-month debt, 6-month debt, as low interest rate debt, okay, as she could sell. She was selling. To him, this seems to be a very large problem. He mentions $9 trillion in federal debt that has to be turned over within a short period of time. So let me give you a dose of reality, which you can check out for yourself. All you have to do is look at the daily Treasury statement. If you look at the daily Treasury statement at the end of fiscal year 2024 and the beginning of fiscal year 2025, let's say the final day of fiscal 2024, you will find that over the year's time, okay, the Treasury will have rolled over roughly between 70 and 80 trillion dollars worth of debt. That it is routine for the Treasury to roll over that amount of debt in a single year. Now, that may sound funny to you because you've heard the figure that, well, the U.S. owes 36 trillion in debt. Well, both of these things are true, okay, at the same time, because the U.S. is constantly rolling over short-term debt. It doesn't have to roll over the short-term debt into long-term debt. It can keep on rolling over the short-term debt, or it can roll over long-term debt into short-term debt. Okay, now Alistair is afraid that this will create a liquidity crisis. But why should it create a liquidity crisis? I don't understand. The federal government is perfectly capable of rolling over whatever volume it has to roll over in whatever time is involved. If it can roll over between 70 and 80 trillion dollars a year, it can roll over $9 trillion between now and the elections of 2026. I mean, that's nothing. That's 2 years. In 2 years, it's rolling over $140 trillion. It dwarfs the $9 trillion Alistair is talking about. Alistair evidently doesn't know much about how the Treasury actually rolls over debt. Neither does the judge, since he doesn't seem at all puzzled by what Alistair is saying. Recently, we've had a problem, or we seem to have had a problem, because the bond markets haven't wanted to snap up, U.S. Treasury debt, okay, in the way they normally do. Okay, that's true. And stories are beginning to circulate. Oh, the bond vigilantes are going to crash the dollar. The bond vigilantes are going to stop the U.S. From actually funding itself with more debt. The fear is we won't be able to fund our deficits. Okay, and the belief is that bond sales do fund federal spending. Well, I've often talked about a paper here by Stephanie Calkin. She wrote in 1999, I believe now, or 98, okay, I forget when, where she showed that neither taxes nor revenue from treasury bonds fund federal spending. Federal spending is funded by congressional appropriations and by the Federal Reserve creating new money whenever it adds reserves to the Treasury spending account. Tax money is not involved, and bond revenue money is not involved either. They represent actually drains of money from the economy, but those drains are then replaced by federal spending. As long as federal spending doesn't slow down, there's not going to be a liquidity crisis. But also, the other point here is, there are two other points here, really. Okay, the first point is that, okay, if you know how auctions of treasuries are done, then you also know that there are 20 official brokers. The brokers, okay, at the auctions are contracted to buy the treasury bonds and resell them into private markets. They're contracted by the Federal Reserve in order to do that. They're constrained by contract to buy the bonds. They have licenses from the federal government to buy those bonds, and they resell them. They are dealers of treasury bonds. Now, let's say the dealers don't have money to buy the treasury bonds. Then they have the option, because they're the dealers, of going to the Fed and asking the Fed to advance them the money needed to buy the treasury bonds. And the Treasury lends them that money at extremely low interest rates. They then happily buy the bonds. In other words, they're not even using their own money. And they turn around and they resell the bonds to the private sector. Now, the private sector always wants to buy the bonds because they're an absolutely safe investment, because the Constitution mandates that the Treasury Department will, when the bonds fall due, pay the interest on the bonds and pay back the principal. So this is a no-risk kind of thing for the private investors. And they love the bonds, generally speaking. But let us say that some strange situation occurred where the bonds were not bought back by investors in the private sector. They couldn't sell them to the private investors. Well, then what then would happen? Would there be some kind of liquidity crisis? No, there wouldn't be a liquidity crisis, because what could happen then is that the Federal Reserve, okay, seeing that no one was buying these bonds from the dealers, then the Federal Reserve could just do QE, quantitative easing. They could buy those bonds in return for newly created Federal Reserve cash. So those bond sales always have to be made. Now, I have to be clear on this, and you should understand. that the Federal Reserve is prohibited from buying the bonds directly from the Treasury Department. That would be viewed as the Fed, actually monetizing the Treasury bonds, which by law it is not allowed to do. However, once these bonds have been sold to the dealers, then the Federal Reserve is free to buy them back from the dealers if the dealers can't find buyers in the bond market. It can't find buyers among the vigilantes. All of a sudden, the demand for the bonds dries up. Well, the Fed is empowered to buy those bonds from the private sector dealers, from the private sector banks that have already bought those bonds with money lent to them by the Federal Reserve. So I want to point out this game is rigged. It's rigged. These bond auctions can never fail. There's no problem. This debt bomb is a false thing. People think there's a debt bomb because they don't understand how this stuff works. But let's say even that there's some glitch in this particular process, and the government can't go through the normal procedures of selling the Treasury bonds. Then there's one more thing the Treasury Department can do to ensure that after it has deficit spent, it can fill its coffers again. That thing, the Treasury Department is empowered to do, because in 1996, a coin law was passed by the Congress, which allows the Treasury to order the mint to mint 1 ounce platinum coins whose face value can be arbitrarily determined by the Treasury Secretary. The mint can make these coins, deposit them at the Fed. The Fed will have to credit these coins to the Public Enterprise Fund, of the mint. Then another law enables the Treasury Department to sweep the seigniorage that has accumulated in the mint's account into the Treasury spending account. In the case of a platinum coin, let's say a platinum coin of $100 trillion, that seigniorage would be $100 trillion minus the roughly $3,500 in cost, or the $4,000 in cost that was incurred by the mint in minting the 1 ounce platinum coin and getting it up to the New York Fed for deposit. So in the worst instance, when auctions that cannot fail because they're rigged, still fail, it is perfectly possible for the executive branch to mint a 1 ounce platinum coin, which has a face value of however much money is needed to cover the deficit spending, or even more, and get that coin deposited at the New York Fed, and eventually almost all the proceeds will be swept in to the Treasury general account. That's the Treasury spending account, which is a resident at the New York Fed as well. So to summarize, there can be no debt bomb. There is no debt bomb. It's a figment of the imagination of people who don't understand the process. The auctions are rigged. They cannot fail. If they do fail because some bozos mix up the whole thing, then the executive branch can have recourse to the minting of platinum coins to refill the Treasury spending account that has become empty due to deficit spending. So, let us now go on with this particular video. Recognizing that the debt bomb is a fiction of the imagination of the bond market. It does not exist.
I know you've been critical of former Treasury Secretary Yellen, but of course, this is the Congress, and each time they raised the debt ceiling and authorized the borrowing and enacted a budget with $1 trillion shortfall, was bipartisan. So it really, I don't know that anyone calculated as you have that so much of it would come due at one time, but this is really the way the government has been operating. If interest rates go up north of 5%, the government won't have the money. It'll be borrowing money in order to pay interest on borrowed money, which of course is a recipe for catastrophe.
Well, of course, okay, it's not a recipe for catastrophe, but let's consider the two issues raised here by that comment from the judge. And the first issue is what happens if we have a debt ceiling crisis and the Congress won't raise the debt ceiling again? Then there cannot be Treasury auctions. So what are they going to do? Well, apart from the fact that the Congress usually caves at about that time and does lift, okay, the debt ceiling, what the executive branch can do to stop a financial crisis at that time is to mint a platinum coin whose face value is large enough to cover any shortfall that anybody wants to cover. It can be a $1 trillion platinum coin that was making the rounds a few years ago, $1 trillion coin. It can be a $10 trillion coin, can be a $15 trillion coin, can be a $100 trillion coin. It's up to the Treasury Secretary, in this case, in particular, Bessent, Scott Bessent. He can order a coin of whatever denomination he wants to place on it, order that coin to be minted by the director of the mint. The mint will do it, deposit the coin in the public enterprise fund account of the mint, get the seigniorage proceeds swept into the Treasury spending account, and that's all she wrote. No financial crisis. So there won't be a catastrophe. No catastrophe, okay, in the offing, except the catastrophe created by the stupidity or political stubbornness of these people involved. No necessary catastrophe. The means is there to avoid the debt bomb, any debt ceiling problems, any other problems. By the way, if the Congress refuses to raise the debt ceiling, and the federal government fails to spend that money which has been appropriated by Congress and scheduled to spend, then some agency withstanding can sue in the federal courts, and its remedy can be to order the president to order the Secretary of the Treasury to mint a platinum coin to cover any shortfall which is being addressed. And what would the grounds be? Well, the grounds would be that the 14th Amendment guarantees the payment of all federal debts. And if payments are being blocked because there's no money in the federal spending account, and the federal government cannot do a treasury auction because the debt limit has been reached, then the remedy of the platinum coins is there, and a lawsuit could be directed at the administration to mint a properly sized, or a properly denominated, I should say, 1 ounce platinum coin to solve the problem. I'll go on now.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000 right now? Well, forget about AI, quantum computing.
Yeah. So this is a really major. I mean, you're absolutely right. The system has been corruptly increasing. I mean, government expenditure has been out of control for so long. So it's not just Yellen, it's been a process that has been going on. So you're right. But it does.
The spending may be out of control for so long, but it wasn't the fault, of Yellen. And there was nothing corrupt at what she was doing in selling short-term bonds or short-term notes, treasury notes. What she was doing in selling those treasury notes was trying to keep the interest rate but to a minimum. Now, treasury notes always have to be sold at a little higher rate, than the overnight interest rates. But the overnight interest rates are being set by the policies of the Federal Reserve. The Treasury doesn't have any control over that. But by selling short-term securities, it can make sure that the interest rates are minimally above the overnight rate which the Fed has enforced. But there was nothing corrupt about what Secretary Yellen was doing. Deficit spending was appropriated by the Congress. You may want to talk about corruption in the Congress, but the spending that was appropriated was mandated to the executive to spend. Secretary Yellen had no choice about that spending. She was mandated to spend it. And the fact that she issued debt to do it was only customary. It was not something corrupt to do that. To issue short-term debt was the most competent thing she could have done. In fact, if the Federal Reserve had reduced its overnight rates to near zero, the interest on that short-term debt from the Fed would also have been near zero. So I don't know what this business of corrupt, I don't know what that refers to by Alistair.
It is something which I think is why he's trying to hurry along, because he's trying to get all this sorted out well before the midterms, and he wants some wins. And the economic situation is not so easy to produce an immediate win because it's so structural. It's a structural one of a devaluation of the dollar, tariffs, and bringing industry back to the United States. All of that.
So here is Judge Knapp engaging in the most gross form of terrorism over the debt, showing people that our debt is coming close to 37 trillion, 36.7 trillion. That is the U.S. national debt. And it says the debt per citizen is 107,414. No, that is not the debt per citizen. The citizen owns nothing. It's also not the debt per taxpayer. The taxpayer owes absolutely nothing. This is a debt contracted by the federal government that the federal government has to repay. It has to repay the debt as it falls due. As it falls due. It doesn't all fall due at once. It falls due over a 30-year period. Now, there's a lot of short-term debt. Half the debt that has to be rolled over in 1 year is probably short-term debt. But as I said, between 70 and 80 trillion dollars is rolled over every year. Right now, you can look at the daily Treasury statement and see that. But I really have to be very emphatic. That debt per citizen figure of $107,414, that is terrorism. I don't owe that. You don't owe that. Debt per taxpayer, $323,000. Even more terrorism. None of us owes that. We didn't contract to get that money in return for a debt instrument. The government did. It's up to us not to allow the government to tax us in order to repay that debt. Because we're not responsible for the debt. These were choices made by the Congress and choices made by the executive branch as well, because the executive branch did not veto the appropriations of the Congress. Yeah, that debt is owed to the people who bought the debt instruments. The payment is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. But the implicit assumption in this particular chart is that that debt will have to be paid by you, the citizen, or you, the taxpayer, or we, the citizens, or we, the taxpayers. That's not true. That debt could be rolled over, or it could be paid off with a platinum coin that was dedicated to paying off the debt as it fell due. There don't have to be any taxes involved. There doesn't have to be any rollover involved. These are policy questions. These are matters for the Congress to decide and for the executive branch to decide. And we are fools. Citizens are fools if we let the federal government take that $36.7 trillion out of our hides. Because the only way that can be repaid by us is through running surpluses. Government surpluses mean deficits in the private sector. We don't want to have deficits in the private sector. The government is able to create the currency. So it has the capability to run those deficits. We don't have the capability to create any currency. And we always have a growing population and growing needs. It's up to the government to deficit spend to fulfill those particular needs. There should be no talk about taxpayers paying for the debt by running surpluses. All that is the most gross kind of terrorism. We should be laughing charts like this out of court. I'll tell you something else. That $36.8 trillion that has not been repaid yet. That money is now in the non-government sector. Some of it is in the foreign sector. Some of it is in the domestic sector. But that $36.8 trillion in debt represents a $36.8 trillion surplus in the non-government sector. You've always got to keep that in mind and understand that. These people don't seem to understand that. They want the private sector to give back $36.8 trillion to the government sector, which has no need for it because it can always create money. That is most the gross kind of ridiculousness I've ever heard. If we ever set about trying to pay that back through taxation, the private sector would go bankrupt. The non-government sector would go bankrupt. It is the stupidest idea on record. I'll go on with this.
There's big structural. It doesn't happen in 2 weeks. It, sometimes take 10 years to start new industry and bring it back. So I think, here this is pushing him very strong to deal with things like Iran and Ukraine, looking for a quick win, and of course, China.
Okay, Alistair is quite right about that part, of the analysis. If we ignore what he has to say about debts and deficits and what the judge has to say about debts and deficits, the rest of the analysis is okay. That's why Trump is looking for a win now. And that's why he has an incentive, a strong incentive, to come to agreement, with the Iranians, and to hold to that agreement, and this time not march away from it like he did in his first term.
What is the deep state, the second of his woes in your article? What does the deep state want of him? Do they want the war in Ukraine to continue and the United States to continue to finance it? Are they still of the illusion that they can use Ukraine as a battering ram? This is Victoria Nuland in 2014. They can use Ukraine as a battering ram with which to drive Vladimir Putin from office. Do they actually believe that?
I don't think they believe it'll drive him out now, but yes, they want to keep the war going, particularly Europeans, because they are desperate. The economic situation is dire. They're really skirting the edge of bankruptcy in some countries. The UK is one of them. You remember what happened to Liz Truss,
Right,
where the bond market rose up against her and she was forced out of office. They're close to that now. And same in France. Same, Germany is entering a period of.
Liz Truss was stupid because the United Kingdom is a monetary sovereign, just like the United States. She might not have had the ability to mint a platinum coin, but she had the capability to order the Chancellor of the Exchequer to order the Bank of England to add to the reserves of the UK government. She didn't have to issue bonds at all. Why was she issuing bonds? She could have ordered the Bank of England just to create the money she needed. Then she wouldn't have been reliant on the bond markets at all. She didn't understand that, and so she went down.
Fiscal crisis also. So they are desperate. And this, if you like, as this happens, Europe is fracturing, moving apart. And they're desperate about this. And the only thing that they can feel that they can bring everyone together is to shout about war and say, oh, Russia, where, this is the cause of all the problems, to deflect the blame from themselves. because there is a rising tide of protests that will eventually drive them out of office. And they're aware of that. And so this is their answer to it, is to, cry war and make people afraid as the means to try and sort of keep some sort of unity. Otherwise, the European Union as a project is just not going to continue, because there's nothing else that's holding it together. There are deep divisions within Europe already, deep divisions within NATO. They talk about the coalition for this war, and how many people are in it? 3 states, France, Britain, and Denmark at the moment. I mean, is that a coalition that's going to take on Russia? Is it going to support Ukraine? I mean, it's fantastical, but this is the message. So the deep state, but we're talking about really, it's as much the European deep state in coordination with the American one. Both of them have a shared objective in undermining Trump's projects. That is the main aim, is to undermine any normalization with Russia. And that is an American deep state interest as much as it's a European deep state interest. Perhaps even driven more.
Given your extraordinary understanding of the intelligence communities in the West, MI6 and CIA, do you think that Trump, via John Ratcliffe, the director of CIA, and Tulsi Gabbard, his boss, the director of national intelligence, can control the American intelligence community, or will it drive him crazy, as it did, not literally crazy, but, make his life miserable, as it did in his first term?
Well, yes, I think they can do, and there are many ways of doing it. And I just hinted at one of the things that's going on is that, that there is a lot of selling of US treasuries. And although people point the finger, it's not China that actually is selling treasuries at the moment. It's coming out of Europe, probably out of London. I don't know where, you can't tell.
Well, I think China is starting to sell more treasuries now as well. I thought I saw an item just in the last couple of days that they were planning on dumping lots and lots, of treasuries. From my point of view, from the point of view of MMT, it's no problem, if they dump the treasuries, because of the considerations that I laid on you a while ago. There always will be customers for treasuries, but even if there aren't always customers for treasuries, we don't have to use treasuries. The treasury doesn't have to use treasuries to get the money it needs. It can always turn to platinum coins, because that law happens to exist.
But it is certainly coming out of Europe, because you see the very obvious signs of it, because, tariffs are being imposed in Europe, and you'd expect the euro to devalue by the equivalent of 10% of the tariff, instead of which it's risen by 9%. It means that someone in Europe is selling a lot of treasuries and reinvesting the money in euros that have driven it up so much. So you can see that, I don't know who's behind it. I don't know their motives precisely, but it is quite likely this is part of an effort to derail the Trump project as a whole.
There is no capability to derail that project, because people start selling treasury bonds in the open market. The reason why there's no capability is what happens when they try to sell the treasury bonds in the open market. Either they can sell them or they can't sell them. If they can sell them, where's the problem? Other buyers are buying the treasury bonds because they know they pay interest, and they know that payment on the treasury bonds is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. There is no problem if people in Europe are dumping treasury bonds. They can dump as many as they want. Now, I've already addressed the case where private sector people are selling treasury bonds to other private sector people, and when the government issues new treasury bonds, that somehow the auction fails. I've explained why the auction cannot fail, but even through some stupidity or other, the auction does fail. Again, the United States can always turn to platinum coins to fund the things it needs to fund. So,
jointly coordinated between, if you like, that part of the deep state, particularly in London and in Washington too. And so they don't like that. And the other part, which is not quite the same, but those that are fiercely protective of Israel, if you like, those that are either supportive of Israel or Zionism, if you like, the institutional Jewish leadership, which gives complete support, both in Europe and in America, to Israel, are intent on preserving Israel. And Israel is in a terrible straits at the moment. There's infighting between the security services, within the political level. You have two prime ministers recently, two recent prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Olmert, who both said, we are at the brink. Israel is literally at the brink. 60% of Israelis say they expect civil war. The Mari poll says, but Olmert and Ehud Barak are saying, the thing, it's going to break. It's going to break. Netanyahu may go or whatever, but Israel is stretched to the limits, and it will end up in internal violence.
Can Donald Trump say no to the Israel lobby? Has he already said no to Prime Minister Netanyahu on bombing Iran?
First of all, that's what the Israelis say, that there was a plan and it was postponed, not that he said no, planned. But where it stands at the moment is very uncertain. From my soundings since about Saturday, it seems that Iran has, despite the sort of language of, we're quite confident, it's been good, the meeting, that Iran has serious doubts about US motives. And they said that. Arachi said that directly to Putin when he went to Moscow, carrying a message from the supreme leader to President Putin. And he said, in our indirect talks with the US, we received contradictory and conflicting messages from the American side. Whatever their intentions or objectives may be, that's their concern. But we, at the moment, what is formally communicated at the negotiating table is what matters for the moment. But none of that was cleared up on this last Saturday, day before yesterday. It wasn't cleared up. So the Iranians don't know. And they don't know what Trump means, because it's much deeper than just, the about turn that we had from Witkoff. I think others have commented on it, but when he turned away from saying capping, if you like, enrichment, to saying that the enrichment must be completely eliminated, must be removed. And so the Iranians are not only puzzled, but they don't know what is Trump's vision for the Middle East. He talks about having a grand vision for the Middle East. And it's not clear what it is. He talks about it as sort of creating peace. He wants to be a peacemaker, but we don't know what it is, because, we see it in parts. when we look at the Gaza part of it, when we look at Yemen, when we look at Syria, what you see is a sort of reorganization of power and demography to certain power brokers, sort of a resetting of power, a deal, but not peace. And where does Iran fit into that? If the ideal is to get a sort of neutered Iran, a neutered, if you like, region that is subservient to the tutelage of Israel. We don't know if that is his thing. Maybe he doesn't want to go that far. Maybe he doesn't. But what I would say to you, basically, I think, and this is, I think probably reflected by the Iranians when you speak to them, is really, to a warmed up Obama JCPOA is not going to be a big win for Trump. It is going to be seen across much of Washington as a loss, as a failure. And so where does that going to take things? So it's complicated, the sort of sense. The Iranians look at that New York Times article, they don't believe the first part of it, they think this is just a peg, the part about how Trump stopped the talk, they don't know who leaked what. They think the main part of the New York Times article, the reason for it was to be able to put forward the narrative that Iran has no air defenses. It's weak, it's not capable of defending itself. It is vulnerable, staggeringly vulnerable.
Well, we know that is not true. According to
Colonel
McGregor, they have better air defenses than the United States has. I want to play President. Yeah, I want to play President Trump on this very topic, Alistair, on Good Friday. So just
Okay, before we do that, what I'd like you to notice, okay, is that Alistair is much more skeptical about the possibility of their coming to a final agreement than Larry was, okay, in his latest blog. He seems to think there's a good chance for them to come to agreement, while Alistair recognizes that Trump does need a win right now. That lots of what he's been doing has been falling apart in terms of the United States. And he hasn't been keeping his promises when it came to foreign policy either. So he needs a win. And Alistair thinks that's a strong motivation for him to get a win by getting an agreement, with Iran. But Alistair also thinks that such an agreement, if it's just a JCPOA 2.0, and it's pretty much the same in terms of the protections offered, he also thinks that's not going to go over big in Washington. He thinks it can't be sold by Trump. When Mike Whitney was talking about it in his article, he seemed to think that Trump might actually be able to sell that kind of an agreement. We know Trump is very good at selling things to his followers, to his base. He can deny reality while selling things to his followers, and they will believe him. He can put, lipstick on a pig. I'm not saying that JCPO2 is going to be a pig. It may be a fine agreement, as was, the first of the JCPOAs. But from Trump's point of view, Trump seemed to want more than a nuclear agreement. He wanted the disarming of Iran. He's not going to get that if he comes to agreement, with the Iranians. So if he keeps holding that as a goal of the negotiations, and Netanyahu would loudly try to hold him to that, then he's going to have to sell against the selling of the Israelis and the selling of Netanyahu's and the selling of the deep state. They're going to try to frame the likely agreement he can make with the Iranians as a failure of the Trump administration. And he's going to try to sell it as the greatest thing since sliced bread. Will he be able to do that? Okay, I don't know, but I don't, after all this time, want to underestimate his capability of selling nonsense to people. He is great at selling nonsense to people. And we have all been the victims of that. And we'll continue to be the victims of that. And going forward.
3 days ago. Chris, cut number 3.
On Iran, would you be open to letting Iran keep some kind of civil nuclear program, or would the entire program need to be dismantled?
I'm for stopping Iran very simply from having a nuclear weapon. They can't have a nuclear
So
weapon.
the
I
entire
want
program
Iran
dismantled?
to be great and prosperous and terrific.
Have you spoken with Xi?
With Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. And if they have a nuclear weapon, you'll all be very unhappy. You'll all be very unhappy.
Have you
because
spoken with Xi?
Your life,
Who is leading
your
those
life
trade
will be in
talks?
great danger.
Never buy magnesium from the store.
For just a little.
Okay, so see,
2 comments like
Trump was emphasizing there. He was emphasizing, stop them from getting a bomb. Well, if he gets JCPOA 2.0, and it's like JCPOA 1.0, it's going to stop them from getting a bomb. Now, of course, there are many of us who believe they don't want to get a bomb. They really don't. They still have the fatwa in place. You know, they take it very seriously. What they want from the United States, if the United States is willing to agree to JCPOA 2.0, and they can get the United States to strongly commit and follow through and end the sanctions, then the Iranians would be very happy with that. They want an end to the sanctions. They want to do business with the world and with the United States. They don't want any sanctions. They don't want any tariffs. They want Trump to make an agreement and follow through with the agreement. And I can tell you what the Iranians are aiming for. They're aiming to turn over the uranium they have now to a party they can trust to give them back, to give the Iranians back to them if the United States violates the treaty. Who do we think is going to get that uranium? Yeah, I don't know how many kilograms they have now. Let's estimate it and say that it's up to 6,500, kilograms, that they haven't gotten back up to the 8,300 kilograms. Who are they going to give the 6,500 kilograms to? I think they want to give it to the Russians. They want to give it to Putin, under the conditions that will be specified in this new treaty, that in case of violation of the treaty by the United States, that Russia will return the uranium to Iran. That's a condition which I think the Iranians are going to want in this particular treaty. They want there to be consequences for the United States if the United States breaks the agreement again. But what the Iranians want to get out of this agreement is the sanctions pulled away. No more sanctions. They're happy to give up the prospect of a nuclear weapon because you want to know something? They don't need any nuclear weapons to destroy Israel. They can do it with their conventional missiles. Going on.
that move the ball, so to speak? Do they help negotiating, or are they just intended to gin up his base here?
I think it is for the domestic American audience, particularly the Hawks, who are part of his team. That is the key thing. We know the team is divided. We know that Witkoff is rather isolated here on this issue as he is on Ukraine. And so I think it's mostly for because, you know, what he's saying, they can't have a nuclear program. If you go back, why it's so neuralgic for the Iranians is because I remember at the time that just before the deal was being agreed in 2015, I went and talked to the Iranian some of the colleagues' National Security Council. And I said to them, you know, the biggest problem in this whole of getting to a deal was the fact that the RAND organization, which was regarded as being the, you know, the authority on nuclear war and matters nuclear at that time. And there was one man, I forget his name now, but he was sort of dominant in this. And he held in Washington the view that any enrichment automatically meant the path to a weapon. It was impossible to say, here is a stop, here is a limit, here is a cap, because once you start down the road to enrichment, he said the automatic process takes you through to a weapon. And there's no way you can really stop that in a physical sense. And so that was dominant at the time. And then when we hear Witkoff going back and saying that same language, that enrichment must be eliminated. And also when we hear talk about the missiles, because this is the second half of it, is they mustn't have a delivery system for a weapon. They cannot have the weapon and they cannot have the path to a weapon, which is enrichment, and then the weapon system. And what Iran says quite straightforwardly on this, and they say, look, you know, we've had two of these meetings where we just have set out the headings of some headings of discussion.
Okay, I think that's enough of that now. I'm going to go on with the other things we have to cover tonight. Okay, but I think the final point on that, okay, is that I think the Iranians will agree to a JCPOA 2 and stringent inspections. It will be a good agreement. It will stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And they're okay with that. Okay, and they will agree to that. But anything more that Trump wants, they will say no to. They will not agree. They don't have an incentive to agree with the other. And I don't think Trump is going to be able to force them into it. I think Witkoff and maybe Tulsi also will be trying to get Trump to agree to a JCPOA 2.0 and to stop there. And they'll try to get Trump to sell it on the basis that he stopped Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and he made the Middle East safe from them having a nuclear weapon, and he made the world safe. And that's the way he'll try to sell it. You know, he will sell it as a victory. When people point out, well, it's the same as the agreement he broke. They will try to have some parts of the agreement that are not exactly the same that he can puff up. But basically, it will be the same. It will be JCPOA 2.0. And there's going to be a political fight over that as that solidifies, with much of the right wing condemning him for selling out. And we're going to see if he has the strength to try to accept the agreement, to implement it, in such a way that the Iranians will stick to it themselves. And we'll have to see if that, is going to work. But there's a political fight over that starting now. It's going to provide also the background for the talks this coming week and for the weeks going forward. And the Israeli lobby is not going to relent in terms of its attempts to torpedo this agreement and to get Trump to join Israel to attack Iran. We'll keep track of that process as it goes on. Right now, though, we're going to check your comments. If there are any, well, I don't see very many. So let's go on then with our next piece. We are now shifting to Trump's real goal when it comes to the tariffs. Hey, Dee, do you want to take this one?
Yes.
Okay. Because I spent a lot of time discussing the other one.
Yes, you did.
Yes.
Okay, and here we go. Port side. What is Trump really planning with his import tariffs? And this is dated April 19th by Mark Vanderpit in the Morning Star. In a revealing speech, Trump's economic advisor has exposed the actual strategy behind the tariff policy, forcing other countries to provide financial support for U.S. world hegemony. In a remarkable speech on April 7, 2025, Stephen Moran, the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump and chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, revealed that the real goal of Trump's tariff policy, using import tariffs as a leverage for forcing other countries to pay for maintaining U.S. world hegemony. According to Moran, the U.S. provides two so-called, quote, global public goods: military protection through its worldwide network of military bases, and the dollar functioning as global reserve currency. This role as a world power, according to Moran, is costly, and it is no longer acceptable, in his view, for other countries to benefit from it for free. The U.S. wants countries to, quote, pay their fair share, under threat of heavy import tariffs as a sanction for refusal. This strategy is described as a, quote, Mar-a-Lago Accord, an informal name for a new global economic order under U.S. terms. The gist of Moran's message is that the military and financial dominance of the U.S. must be preserved, and that it can no longer be financed solely by the U.S. itself. He argues that it is unsustainable for other countries to benefit from U.S. power structures without contributing to the cost. The U.S. will therefore pressure foreign governments with high import tariffs until they agree to accept favorable terms from Washington. On April 2nd, Trump imposed very high import tariffs on nearly all countries. A few days later, he suspended that measure for 3 months pending talks with the countries involved, a postponement excluding China. In the meantime, a 10% tariff remains in place for all countries. Bretton Woods. Instead of reforming or democratizing the current world order, established as the Bretton Woods system in 1944, Trump wants to reinforce his imperialist structure. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 marked the beginning of an international economic order centered on U.S. hegemony. In a world devastated by war, the U.S. emerged as the only economic superpower. Under its leadership, a system was created in which the dollar became the global anchor. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was convertible to gold. This gave the U.S. an exceptional position, as other countries had to accumulate dollars to keep their economies running and to trade, while the U.S. could print dollars without issue. The institutions created as part of the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank, were established in Washington and largely operated according to U.S. interests and conditions. Bretton Woods formed the economic pillar of that hegemony. NATO laid its military foundation under the guise of collective security against the Soviet threat. The U.S. gained a firm foothold in Europe through NATO, with military bases, troops, and a leading role in the strategic decision-making. Trump wants to preserve U.S. hegemony, both in terms of currency and military power. He wants other countries to fund it. Moran put it clearly, if countries want to enjoy the, quote, geopolitical and financial umbrella of the U.S., they will have to pay for it. The threat of tariffs thus becomes a kind of tax on foreign cooperation with the U.S. Trump's wish list. In his speech, Moran formulated 5 concrete ways in which countries can contribute their, quote, fair share to U.S. hegemony. First, they can simply accept import tariffs without taking countermeasures, thereby generating revenue for the Treasury to finance public goods.
Okay, I guess I have a question about that. First of all,
I know, it's crazy.
okay, when they say they can simply accept the import tariffs, what does that mean? Okay, their companies will have to decide whether they want to export, to the United States. If they believe the people here, with the tariffs on their goods, will fail to buy those goods, then they're just not going to export here.
Mm-hmm.
If they think there's no market here because the tariffs have made those goods too expensive, then they're not going to send their goods here in return for our electronic bits of information. We won't get the real wealth that we've been getting from them. And if they don't send those goods here, or if those goods won't sell here, then those import tariffs are not going to be generating any revenue for the Treasury to finance public goods. And by the way, why do we need revenue from the import tariffs to finance public goods here?
It's ridiculous. It makes no sense.
We can create our own money
Right.
to finance public goods here. Why do we need to? Also, we have to keep in mind, this is all in the dollar system. We only trade in dollars. We only pay for things, okay, in dollars. We're not willing to do anything else as a country. We don't deal in foreign currency here. So what we're doing is we're taking back our dollars from them, which means eventually they're going to run out of dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, if the prices for their goods are too high here and nobody buys their goods, they won't be getting any US dollars anymore. And so they won't be able to spend those dollars on our goods. Again, the result of that is there won't be any revenue generated. I mean, we're all in the dollar system here. We don't accept their currency that they create. We only accept the currency we create.
Right.
continue to create. Okay, please go on with the second.
Second, they can open their markets to U.S. exports and purchase more U.S. made products.
How can they do that if they don't have US dollars to purchase those exports? I mean, we've just said that in other words, they don't create the US dollars.
No, they don't. It's
They
crazy,
can
the whole
buy
thing.
the US exports. The only way they can buy the US exports is if they get dollars from their exports to us. So second,
Insanity.
practical. So let's go on to third.
Third, countries are expected to increase their defense spending, but specifically by purchasing weapons and equipment from U.S. companies.
But for that, they also need our US dollars. They
Exactly.
can't purchase our weapons if we don't purchase their bananas. I mean, or their
Ah,
computer systems or whatever. I mean, what? This is insanity.
it is. Fourth, foreign companies can shift part of their production to the U.S. This spares them import tariffs and creates jobs in the U.S.
Okay. Well, okay. If they choose to do that, then I guess that's fine. But they may decide that it's just too much trouble
Right.
and that they'd rather just trade with other countries who are not making them go through this shit.
Exactly.
Okay. But the point here is, though, okay, uh, we don't need them to create jobs here in the United States
Right.
because we can, first of all, pass a federal job guarantee program
Mm-hmm.
that will provide jobs for any people in this country who wants one at a
Mm-hmm.
socially inclusive type of living wage, doing things that stakeholders in local communities say they need to have done.
Right.
We can upgrade our whole country that way, but apart from that, we can create jobs here by using our dollars that we create to subsidize new companies. If we want to have companies that will compete with their companies,
Mm-hmm.
we can offer all kinds of grants and subsidies to new companies that start here and will create jobs here. We don't need to have foreign companies shift part of their production to the United States. We can create our own companies. In fact, if we want our own companies to be able to compete with companies overseas, we're going to have to create those companies here
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. Please go on.
Okay. Finally, and most explicitly, imperialist Moran stated that countries can simply write checks to the U.S. Treasury in the form of long-term bonds, loans, such as 100-year Treasury bonds with low yields, which lose value through inflation, effectively subsidizing Washington.
Why does Washington need subsidies in dollars when it can create the dollars itself? Why do we need this stuff?
I know, it's
Why do we
BS.
need this?
It's insanity.
What's wrong with this guy, Marin? Doesn't he understand we create our own money?
Obviously, he doesn't.
He doesn't seem to, and neither did the judge, and neither did Alistair Crook. None of these so-called experts don't seem to understand, even though it's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and even though the Federal Reserve does it every single day, they don't understand we create our own money here. Please go on.
In his speech, Moran implicitly acknowledge the existence of the so-called Tariff dilemma, the fundamental conflict whereby a country that issues the world's reserve currency, in this case the US, must run a structural trade deficit, import more than it exports in order to circulate enough dollars for international trade.
Well, I'm glad he recognizes that because we were just talking about it, but our arguments about it seem to indicate that what he was suggesting wasn't very practical.
No.
But please continue.
However, this deficit ultimately undermines the country's own industrial base. Iran admitted that his role has decimated U.S. manufacturing and that the trade deficits have become, quote, unsustainable.
Okay, the trade deficits are not unsustainable. They just have to be matched by budget deficits. In other words, the trade deficits withdraw money from the economy of the United States, at a macroeconomic level. There are leakage from the economy of the United States. There are other leakages like savings, private savings are also leakages. Okay. What we have to do with our federal budgets is to compensate for those particular leakages by running budget deficits. Because what do the budget deficits do? They replace the money that has leaked to trade and that has leaked to savings with new money for the economy. So it's simple. Our budget deficits have to match our leakages to trade, our leakages to savings, and our leakages to taxation. Because taxation is another source of leakage. Also, we have a leakage to bond sales as well. So we should compensate for that too. That means we have to run deficits, that are very large. And as far as undermining our country's own industrial base, it's not so that this is inevitable, because all we have to do is see to it that we subsidize our country's industrial base so it can continue to function well and can continue to employ people. And we can move on to new types of businesses and new types of industries as long as the industries are properly subsidized by the government in the way that industries were all through the history of development in the United States. Our problem is that we haven't been subsidizing our industries because we don't want to pick winners and losers. We got to start picking winners and losers, subsidizing the industries we need. And the industries we don't need, because we can get the goods from foreign countries that will always trade with us and are always friendly to us, we can let them do that work. And we can do the work that's essential to our own security, to cleaning up our environment, to doing other things that we absolutely need. We never have to use tariffs. We can always use simply subsidies. And we have to run budget deficits, large ones, all the time. Our budget deficits, again, have to match the linkages to taxation, to savings, to foreign trade, and to bond sales if we, like idiots, continue to sell bonds, which I don't think we need to do.
No.
Anyway, please go on.
Still, the Trump administration wants to both maintain and reform the system and wants to continue benefiting from the dominant position of the dollar while forcing other countries to bear the cost that this dominance entails.
Well, stupidity, we don't have to force other countries to bear the cost because we can create the dollars to pay for the costs here. But even more importantly, why do we have to continue to be the reserve currency? I mean, it's just admitted by Miran that being the reserve currency has cost us jobs. So why do we have to continue to be the reserve currency? Because we want to dominate the international system in a military way? Sorry, that's not good for us. That is not good for us.
No.
And it's also not fair for the rest of the world. We have a large population here. It's 340 million people by now. But that's nothing compared to the population of other major countries in the world. In particular, it's nothing compared to India. It's nothing compared to China. And there are a number of other nations that are beginning to approach our population as well, nations in the global south. We have entered a multipolar world, as Marco Rubio has admitted. The multipolarity implies that we have to recognize the currencies of other nations, that we have to understand that they're going to want to trade in their own currencies also. And we have to understand that 340 million people are not going to be able to dominate the 8 billion people in the rest of the world, not going to be able to militarily dominate them. All we're doing is setting up a situation that will continue to create the wars all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Please keep going.
China as the enemy. Within this plan, China is presented as the primary adversary, according to Miriam. Beijing is, quote, the greatest enemy of the U.S., and the economic relationship with China constitutes the central battle in the global power struggle. Trump has already imposed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods and wants to decouple U.S. production from that of China. The U.S. wants to develop alternative supply chains with, quote, friendly countries that, according to Moran, treat U.S. interests, quote, fairly. Moran claims that countries with large trade surpluses, like China, are weak in a trade war because they depend on exports and on the U.S. market. In his view, the U.S. is stronger because it can replace imports from China either by sourcing from other partner countries or by having goods produced domestically by foreign companies. According to him, Washington is playing an economic game of chicken with China, hoping that Beijing will blink first. Meanwhile, economists warn that ordinary U.S. citizens will end up footing the bill through inflation, while the benefits of this economic confrontation mainly go to the financial and industrial elite, as illustrated by the planned corporate tax cuts.
Well, that could happen, but it doesn't have to happen.
Right.
Depends on our domestic policy here.
Mm-hmm.
And our domestic policy here should compensate our citizens for any inflation caused by that particular game of chicken. But most importantly, that game of chicken should not be getting played in the first place.
No,
Why do we need it? What does it do for us?
I don't know.
Please go on.
Mar-a-Lago. With this, the Trump administration is attempting nothing less than to rewrite the economic foundations of the world order as it emerged after World War II. Since Bretton Woods, the U.S. has shaped the world order to suit its own interest. With the dollar as global currency and Wall Street as the main beneficiary of international capital flows, this hegemony is also supported by the enormous military apparatus, with around 800 foreign bases. Iran and Trump do not want to democratize or share this dominance, but rather outsource its cost and further centralize its benefits within the U.S. The grand deal Trump hopes to achieve is being called the, quote, Mar-a-Lago Accord. The term refers to Trump's luxury resort and echoes the Plaza Accord of 1985, when the Reagan administration forced its allies, Japan, Britain, France, West Germany, to raise the value of their currencies against the dollar. That accord had disastrous consequences for Japan. It led to a massive economic bubble and decades-long economic stagnation. Trump now hopes for similar deals with his allies, but is also aiming for broader international compliance. It remains highly uncertain whether countries will allow themselves to be misled again. China, in any case, has already retaliated in kind and will impose import tariffs of up to 125%. In addition, Beijing is launching an alternative to the US dominated SWIFT payment system, which could seriously undermine the position of the dollar in long term. In the next 3 months, there will be intensive negotiations between the US and the rest of the world that will be decisive for future trade relations with the US. But also in the rest of the world, there will undoubtedly be a great deal of consultation among countries to determine how to best position themselves, jointly or not, in the face of this new and unprecedented aggression from the US. The next 90 days will therefore be very important. The ways in which the world will respond to this brutal trade policy of the US will help shape the, quote, economic world order of the coming decades. Neoconservatives. Also important to mention, Moran's speech took place behind closed doors at the Hudson Institute, a neoconservative think tank in Washington, D.C., funded by wealthy right-wing donors such as Rupert Murdoch, Charles Schwab, and Harlan Crow. The Institute also receives money from multinationals like Meta, AT&T, Chevron, and weapons giants like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, all actors with a vested interest in a hard-line foreign policy from Washington. Symbolically, 4 flags waved on stage. Those of the US, Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, all key players in the US geopolitical strategy against China and Russia. It is crystal clear Trump's economic plan is openly imperialist, a leverage for forcing other countries to pay for a US-led world order, over which those countries themselves have no say. Through tariffs, economic intimidation, and the punishment of those who seek alternatives to the US dollar, the US aims to keep countries submissive. These are typical tactics of a mafia boss. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is, in essence, an attempt to impose economic taxes on the rest of the world, to keep an outdated empire alive at all costs, and to provide Trump's friendly elite with a tax cut.
So that's it. What's being said here is that the purpose of the tariffs is to exact monetary tributes from other nations. Those tributes are to be in US dollars. When the US dollars come back to the Federal Reserve, well, when they come back to the U.S. Treasury, okay, when they come back eventually to the Federal Reserve, which they will, those dollars, when they reach the Federal Reserve, will simply be destroyed. Of what use, okay, are those dollars to the United States? Well, maybe Mirren thinks that those dollars will be useful to somehow to finance, to replace the money that would be coming in from taxes, so the country can afford a tax cut. However, they are not necessary, because the taxes from the wealthy are not really required to make the kind of spending we need to do in this country affordable. I'm not for allowing them their tax cuts, but I don't want their tax cuts for other reasons. I don't want them dominating the political system. I don't want them buying politicians. I don't want to have the extreme degree of inequality we have now, okay, in this country. But make no mistake about it, we don't need their money. And we don't need any money from other countries in order to pay for the things we need here. This whole scheme is based on silly assumptions that make no sense, and that put the United States up as a mafia state,
Mm-hmm.
extorting tribute from the rest of the world. Why is that important to us? Why do we want to do that?
Yeah, why do we want to bully the world?
Trump wants to do that because he wants to be the bully of the world. But it should be of no interest to all of the rest of us. It's just insanity. It's just going to cause wars.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we want that?
Right, he says he wants to be a man of peace.
Yeah, man of peace, my pig's eye. He
I
wants
know, right?
a man of peace like the mafia boss wants to be a man of peace.
Right.
Earl of Laurel says the author covered it so well, it's not much else to say. Evelina Pont said, was unaware of the breaches in the deal with Iran back in 2016. Is that supposed to make the president appear to be more honorable? I don't know. I think he was totally dishonorable. I took my 401k out of stocks and put it in bonds because I'm getting old. I hope I did the right thing. Steve, all the money will be paid back on time with the interest that you contracted for. It's in the 14th Amendment. If all you wanted out of it was the return the bonds, okay, are offering, then you're going to get that return. I do believe returns from the stock market will be better. The stock market will be more volatile, especially given what Trump is doing. But if you want to spend your time day trading on the stock market, I have no doubt if you learn how to day trade, that those returns will be far better, far better. Evelina Pont says the wheeling and dealing. Evelina, so the debt bomb is rigged too. How distressing that the government is constantly pulling the wool over our eyes. Yeah. Antonio Calhouse says, hello, Antonio. could be a swap, USD, EUR, or any set of main IMS, International Monetary System currencies. Antonio says good night. The INDs was a farce. Still, Iran is out of the tracks. I don't know what you mean. The uranium goes to South Africa. SA can sell their mini nukes, small nuclear power plants. Now the uranium is going to go to Russia. Europeans seem to be accommodating, though they're increasing their military budgets at the behest of U.S., creating austerity for their people. It's so wonderful. They don't have to do any of that because the Russians don't want to threaten them. Mainly what the Russians want to do now is develop their own country and trade with Asia. Implicit is the agreement to buy weapons from the U.S. Yeah, I know. Been doing it for so long, EADS creation was a landmark. Austerity by design is Europe's trademark. I'm afraid that's true, Antonio. With enough of a state of welfare and exchange, it appears to be different now, with much of the welfare state flailing with new austerity, causing rifts in the Union. Preparing for war seems to be an existential matter. The one thing keeping the Union together, and NATO alive. Well, that's just because the Union, people are not ready to move to a true union yet. So they have this very limited union where the European government is so weak that it cannot compensate for economic cycles. It only allows the member nations to run deficits of 3%. There are two things which the Europeans can do to avoid this terrible situation. Thing one, they can break up the union, get their own currencies back, so they have the flexibility to compensate for economic cycles. Or they can move forward to a political union where the central government will compensate with fiscal policy for the economic cycles. Those are the two things they can do. Evelina Apon says, I still think you're better off than Americans right now. But the potential for Americans to be better off is great. It depends on whether our political system is able to adapt. Whether it can or not, okay, I do not know. Well, we have to get on with our stuff. We have a few good pieces yet to do. There's another piece by it's by Mike Whitney, and it's an interview with Wabin, and it's called China's Tariff Smackdown. Relatively short, won't take us too much time. There's a picture, I think, of Mulan, the legendary female warrior, of China. This particular young woman is absolutely gorgeous, of course. Question one, what are Trump's tariffs on China supposed to achieve, and will they succeed? Wabin says, I don't think Trump has a clear idea himself, because many of the supposed goals are contradictory, and historically he's a shoot from the hip type guy, no deep thinking, always swinging, and never ashamed of his own blatant lies. That said, he has referred to several objectives. One, tariffs as a revenue source to offset his intended tax cuts for the donor class. Yeah, so much for that nonsense. Using tariffs to reshore manufacturing and reindustrialize. Tariffs are not enough to do that, and are not the best way of doing it. 3, tariffs as a way to embargo trade with China. Well, he can do that more simply, just embargo trade with China. Tariffs as a negotiating tool to get concessions from trade partners to buy more U.S. goods, invest in the U.S., buy 100-year interest-free U.S. treasuries, purchase U.S. weapons, etc. Yeah, we've already discussed the madness of that particular thing. In Trump's mind, numbers 2, 3, and 4 are all linked to China. China is the main perpetrator of manufacturing job loss in the United States. So, well, Mexico, I think, has been doing a pretty good job too. So, reindustrialization is largely about bringing back jobs from China. Imposing trade sanctions on China, even a full embargo, has long been in the cards as part of the decoupling of the two economies in preparation for an eventual military conflict. In fact, both sides want to reduce or eliminate dependencies on each other, although Trump is much less patient and strategic. Lastly, I have no doubt that the concessions Trump wants from other trading partners are aimed at reducing their economic ties with China. The goal is to isolate China economically, as explicitly articulated by Bessent and Lutnick. Yeah. Good luck with that, boys. This is essentially what the West did to Russia after the Ukraine war broke out. How's that going? How's that working out for us? But Trump is ready to push the schedule ahead on China in the absence of a more credible pretext. Trump may think he is playing 3D chess. I think he's playing 1D chess. But his plan has not been well thought out, which is obvious now that China has refused to back down. After stocks, bonds, and the dollar went into free fall, he panicked and rolled back part of his program, which is a clear sign of poor preparation and faulty assumptions. Of course, he didn't hesitate to help his family and friends profit from the market turmoil through insider trading, similar to the way Hunter Biden used his father's influence for self-enrichment. Other indications that if tariff strategy is half-baked, including the laughable math beyond the reciprocal quote-unquote tariff calculation, and the many contradictions of what he was trying to accomplish. For example, why did he try to humiliate the trading partners who came to negotiate? Trump says, quote, kiss my ass, unquote. If he was serious about enlisting their help to embargo China, how did he expect them to do that without inputs from the largest manufacturing power in the world, China, who controls many of the critical supply chains? I don't know how he could help that. Okay, I think his kiss my ass stuff is purely a matter of gratification of his own ego. So much of what he does is about his ego. Personally, I would have fired anyone who presented me with such a poorly thought out business plan. But the U.S. is now a state ruled by one man alone, so there's no accountability, and Trump can do whatever he wants. China Foreign Minister Wang Yi, we will uphold the basic rules of free trade. We will not bow to power politics or bullying. Yeah, I don't think China exactly engages in free trade. It does all kinds of subsidization of its businesses. That has been characteristic of forever. I'm not condemning that. What I'm saying is that that's what we in the U.S. should do also. China Foreign Minister Southeast Asia achieved a consensus. We will stand united and say no to these backward and regressive actions. This is a statement from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The second achievement is we in the three countries. Yeah. Question 2, which country will be hurt more by the tariffs, the U.S. or China? Wabin says, as China has repeatedly said, there are no winners in a trade war, but in the absence of a negotiated settlement, China will likely suffer more short-term pain from loss of the U.S. consumer market. This is going to impact GDP and employment. Clearly, the country needs to stimulate more domestic consumption, was now more urgent than ever. It also needs to redirect some trade to other countries. There could be deflationary pressures domestically, but China has plenty of ways to fiscally stimulate consumption to mitigate the impact, especially since the state controls the flow of credit via state-owned banks. Longer term, the current trade war will likely pave the way for a complete decoupling between the world's two economic superpowers, similar to the separation between Russia and the West. On the U.S. side, the short-term impact means the loss of the Chinese market for its agriculture and energy products, which represent 70% of Chinese imports from the U.S. Inflation is inevitable. There will be shortages of certain goods for consumers, businesses, and for many U.S. manufacturers that rely on imported parts, components, and critical minerals from China for their production. Okay, such as, for example, um, uh, machine tools, rare earth, battery, and active pharmaceutical ingredients. The main thing to remember is that China sits at the very top of the global supply chain, where the U.S. is at the bottom. So any disruptions to the supply chain will cascade downward, amplifying the damage to the U.S. economy. I think that's absolutely correct. Given China's pole position in many high-tech manufacturing supply chains, these impacts are likely to become long-term problems. U.S. businesses will need to invest more in CapEx to strengthen domestic supply chains, factories, and skilled labor, etc., at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars. Unfortunately, these new American industries will face stiff competition in international markets and are unlikely to be profitable for quite some time. So the government will have to subsidize them for quite some time. So what? Also, there aren't many corporate executives who will want to invest capital required to reindustrialize without explicit assurances from the government their investment will be protected. Trump's flip-flop on these matters is certainly no help. Absolutely. Trump has to guarantee subsidies for a long time until these companies are competitive. In my opinion, the U.S. will find the transition back to a country that produces things extremely painful and perhaps impossible. I suspect that's why China is taking a hard line and made it clear that it will fight to the end if the U.S. insists on imposing an unfair deal. In short, Trump has no cards vis-a-vis China, and there is Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Leaked document reveals ultimate goal of Trump's trade war, quote, force EU to choose between U.S. and China. U.S. President Donald Trump wants to force the European Union to trade who it wants to trade with, the U.S. or China, according to a leaked document circulated among ministers and senior officials, in the Irish government. Question 3. In your opinion, should Trump seek greater economic integration with China or continue along the current path of economic isolation, sanctions, and conflict? Wabin says, there's no doubt that economic cooperation is mutually beneficial, and frankly, the U.S. could use China's help to reindustrialize if that is the real goal. And the two economies are complementary in many ways. The U.S. actually runs a multi-billion-dollar surplus with China in services, although the Trump regime chose to focus entirely on the trading of merchandise, it runs a structural deficit in most of the world. Note, in 2024, the U.S. trade deficit with China was approximately $295 billion for goods alone, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. When including both goods and services, the deficit was around $263 billion, as reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So there are the actual figures from Wabin. The U.S. exports far more tech, IP, financial services, business services, education, and tourism to China than the other way around. The two economies have many synergies. However, given the current U.S. political consensus to treat China as the new bogeyman, any compromise is highly unlikely, and even if a deal is struck, I don't think there's enough trust on either side to sustain an agreement for very long. So an economic and trade divorce is a high probability outcome, if not immediately, then in the next 3 to 5 years. The world is likely to bifurcate into two camps, with most nations trying to find a balance between China and the U.S. In the long run, I believe China has the more dynamic of the two economies and will emerge from the current trade war triumphant. In contrast, the U.S. will find it much harder to muddle through while trying to manage plunging markets, a steadily weakening currency, and an ocean of red ink. Of course, the worst option for the United States would be a direct military confrontation with China. As I have explained in earlier articles, the U.S. would undoubtedly lose a war with China, which would greatly accelerate the pace of America's decline. If that were to happen, the post-war international order would be kaput. And And Trump wants countries to pay tribute, okay, to the United States. And that, of course, is absolutely true, as we made that point before. Okay, I think that article is excellent. Really, really excellent. The views, okay, of Wabin were extremely well taken. The only critique I would have of it is that, as usual, the analysts do not come to grips with the possibility of the U.S. To finance its trade deficits, through budget deficits that are large enough to finance the trade deficits, and also through its ability to subsidize new industries and make them competitive, no matter how many years it takes. We have that capability because we can fund anything domestically that we want to fund. And there are no limits to our funding power of what we want to fund here, okay, in the United States. I don't think that these commentators, none of the commentators we've gone over so far, have taken that into account in case, okay, there's a trade war. So I'll stop sharing that. We will look briefly at some further comments. So John B. is here. Somehow we've got to convince people like Napolitano, Ritter, Johnson, McGregor et al. Their civic duty is to learn how the U.S. monetary system actually works. I agree, John B. I don't know how we're going to convince them of that. That failure to do so means to unwillingly complicit in the destruction of the U.S. nation. If they love their nation, they must learn macroeconomic truth. The neocon corporatist Trumpites in Washington are blindly believing the BS they've been spouting since the 1980s. In unchecked power, they are steering the U.S. into civil and economic catastrophe. Right. Is Ireland still in the EU? Yeah, they are. Obstinate failure to properly inform themselves when the irrefutable truth is not hard to find is akin to treason. Well, I don't know if I'm going to run around labeling people as treasonous. For certain things, maybe, but not for to properly inform themselves. If we saw that as treason, we'd be penalizing most people in the United States, I'm afraid. But I share your feelings that it is absolutely reprehensible that these people will not read just a few of the MMT books that are out there now. It's not a big burden. I mean, it might take them 3 days to become reasonably well informed. It's not much of a time investment, and it's worth everything because it would inform their commentary in international politics. I don't know if you saw the early part of the video, but I went over a video of Judge Knapp, okay, and Alistair Crook, and the things they had to say about the debt, and the deficit, and the influence it was going to have on international affairs were absolutely ignorant and stupid. And of course, I just had to say so also. So, okay, going to our next and final piece, which is your turn, Dee.
Okay.
I'm going to share the screen for the newest piece by the wonderful journalist Pepe Escobar.
Yay, Pepe.
Yeah.
April 21st, 2025. The Shanghai spirit. China will take no bullying.
Oh, look at that.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Shanghai buildings.
hmm
Yes, they do look beautiful.
Shanghai, there could not be a more strategic place to spend these past Trump tariff tizzy.
TTT.
Heady days then in Shanghai, China's trade, commercial, and cultural capital.
Yeah, the Chinese New York.
Yeah, it's a lot cleaner and prettier.
I guess these days.
Yeah. From the top of the Jin Mao Tower in the world-class Luzhizhou Financial District in Pudong, an elegantly discreet Art Deco companion to the World Financial Center super skyscraper, the trademark symbol of China's economic power. It is as if the spoke of a wheel radiated to the Bond and beyond, tracking a ceaseless drive to counteract the absurd idiocy of the quote empire of tariffs.
The emperor of tariffs.
Yeah, emperor of tariffs.
I also thought he was the emperor of chaos.
Yeah, he's both. Relentless, mocked across myriad Chinese social media platforms. I have had the privilege to transit from the Bund Financial Center, which hosts, among other, Fosun Foundation, a bamboo-inspired architectural masterpiece, to the China Academy at the immaculate campus of Fudan University, where I shared a seminar with a star professor, Zhang Weiwei, and a round table with the PhD students from several disciplines. Professor Zhang Weiwei is the foremost conceptualizer of China as a civilization state. The key theme of our seminar was the Russia-China strategic partnership, but inevitably the focus switched back and forth to the rationale behind the emperor of tariffs. The questions from the students were as sharp as they come. That was compounded with an in-depth interview for China Academy hosted by their CEO, the formidable Pan Zholi. A visit to the headquarters of Guancha, the top independent news analysis site in China, whose several channels in several different platforms reach an astonishing 200 million people, could not have been more timely. Guai Zhizhen, a research fellow from the China Institute who was part of our roundtable at Fudan University, came up with one of the most astute analyses of what he describes as Trump's, quote, deranged money making technique. While meeting with Guancha's new editor-in-chief, He Xiangquan, and discussing with hyper-competent international relations specialists Kelly Liu and Yang Hanyi, the Chinese Institute's communications officer, we watched together an exceptional podcast featuring PLA Colonel Wang Lihu Gua Zhikai, Deputy Director of the Center for China and Globalization, CCG, and the always essential Li Bu, President of the Shanghai Zhonghui Development Strategy Institute.
More unbelievable architecture.
Exactly. And that's when Mao Zedong's legendary 1960s formulation of the U.S. as a, quote, paper tiger, quoted in everything from Latin American guerrilla slogans to good art movies resurfaced with full force. Wang Lehu picked up on what President Xi had told Putin at their landmark meeting at the Kremlin 2 years ago. We are right in the middle of changes not seen in 100 years. Wang, quote, this change cannot be changed all at once, and the trade war between China and the United States will not be resolved once and for all. This kind of friction and struggle, in the words of Chairman Mao, is making trouble, falling, making trouble again, falling again until destruction. Wang wrapped up with what may encapsulate the general feeling in China, identified in every nook and cranny across Shanghai. Quote, it is difficult for the United States to repair itself from within. Now the United States has to confront China and the whole world, and its strength is obviously not enough. So failure is inevitable. We are not afraid of a protracted war because time is on our side. China, quote, not afraid of war, however it may manifest itself from hybrid to hot, is the consensus feeling in Shanghai, borrowing from the Maoist concept of, quote, united front, and espoused from academics and business leaders to residents of, quote, model quarters of the Maoist era still impeccably preserved, and with an eye for innovation. Example, row after row of AC outlets to feed the array of electric bikes parked in the internal patios. The, quote, paper tiger lashes out. It was immensely enlightening to share business dinners with executives and salespeople coming from several Chinese provinces. From the stunning Pei Mansion, one of the most beautiful early 20th century buildings in Shanghai, where star architect I.M. Pei lived for 1 year, to the best Zhejiang restaurants in town, Ali Yang at the World Financial Center, complete with the full Agar Lamb experience.
Oh, God, I wonder what that's about.
Yeah. In all conversations and debates, a constant, no illusions about Trump 2.0's shifting strategy and how it should be turned against him, Sun Chow style. How China must amass a solid set of bargaining chips, and most of all, how, from the beginning, this was always a war of an elite section of the American ruling classes on China. The rest of the world is a sideshow. So it's no wonder that in every business dinner after a matchless gastronomic feast, the conversation soon veered on how China's strategy will not be about immediate damage control, and how China is already eyeing new links and nodes to deepen its long-term global competitiveness. It's an open question whether Trump 2.0 and his team of xenophobes will manage to prevent the emergence of a global majority strategic alliance against the empire of chaos.
There it is, the Empire
Ye-
of Chaos.
Yep. In Shanghai and across China, submission is simply not an option. In cultural terms, Trump has managed to antagonize 1.4 billion Chinese simultaneously by treating the civilization state without respect. The one thing that irks Chinese the most is mistreatment. See, for instance, the century of humiliation.
Wow, look at those buildings.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
A full blown trade war. Deep decoupling. Bring it on. The empire of tariffs particularly hit Southeast Asia's supply chains. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, for all ASEAN 10, their major trade partner is China. Chinese FDI is quite important in Cambodia and troubled post-earthquake Myanmar. There's no question ASEAN will have to act in a, quote, strategically multilateral manner. President Xi's timely tour of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia is already setting the tone. Corroborated by Foreign Minister Yang Yi, quote, Southeast Asia achieved a consensus. We will stand united and say no to these backward regressive actions.
Yes.
The Trump tariff TTT, is a war against BRICS and ASEAN, and the increasing presence of ASEAN within BRICS as full members, Indonesia and partners, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Top Chinese intellectuals are fully aware of it. Trump, for his part, considering his record, does not even know what BRICS and ASEAN actually means. At the BRICS preparatory Sherpa meetings ahead of the summit in early July in Rio, there's already serious movement to counteract the unprecedented protectionism of the Trump trade war, as formulated by the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. Trump has already issued a trademark threat, a 150% tariff on BRICS members. Top BRICS members China is not intimidated. Busy building a global consensus against bullying. Meanwhile, in Beijing, in tandem with all the intellectual frenzy in Shanghai, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, wearing a business suit, he prefers leather jackets, as a sign of respect and speaking in English, even though he was born in Taiwan, had a mega significant meeting with Ren Hongbin, chairman of the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade, CCPIT. So, here we have the multi-billionaire CEO of an American chip, but most telling, the Chinese government in person, that his company remains totally committed to the Chinese market, despite Trump 2.0's stiff export restriction on AI chips. A new book, The Thinking Machine, Jensen Huang, NVIDIA, and the World's Most Coveted Microchip, is essential reading to understand how Huang thinks. He's an Asian immigrant who came from poverty, personifies the old school American dream, does not take any nonsense from anyone, and is hyper competitive. Wang is fully aware that NVIDIA simply cannot lose the Chinese market. Moreover, he knows that before 2030, Chinese engineers will release their own GPU and may put NVIDIA out of business. Back to Shanghai, flying out of Guangdong Airport, it was easy to see why China's air passenger traffic hit a record high in the first quarter of 2025, even in a climate of, quote, crisis and fierce competition, including high-speed rail, compounded with the human tsunami taking over Nanjiang Road on a Friday night. That necessitates rows and rows of military police to discipline the human flow on both sides of the pedestrian wall. Consumer crisis? What crisis? In parallel, across the Pacific, Taobao is now number 2 and counting on Apple's App Store in the US. Everyone is eager not only for virtual TikTok videos, but to go on an unlimited shopping spree of affordable made in China products. On the military front, China has just come up with a non-nuclear hydrogen bomb. No uranium, no plutonium, just a matchless chemical engineering compound solution. Declining empires waging proxy wars are so last century. The new Chinese bomb weighs just 2 kilograms lasts 15 times longer than TNT, and its fireball exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius. The key lesson of these past heady days in Shanghai may be that China is now firmly strategically focused all across the planet to occupy the moral high ground. Trump tariff tizzy, TTT, may not improve the American trade deficit. What's clear is that it has already imploded American trustworthiness. Moreover, China's absolute priority goes way beyond global trade. Everyone familiar with Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping thought knows it's all about achieving national modernization, unification, and weaving with partners on all continents, a quote, community of shared future. So geopolitically and geoeconomically, this is the roadmap ahead. Shanghai is showing that China is relishing its new role as a resistance beacon, bent on defying bullying, busy building a global majority consensus. It's all about strategic patience with a chaotic empire out of control. Simply does not have. Right, we have the nutcase Trump.
Yeah, I really agree tremendously with this article, generally speaking. But I would hope, and I don't know if I can hold out a lot of hope for this, but I still hope that we are adaptive enough to begin to understand that we need to change.
Definitely.
It's far too late in the game, but if we change, okay, and if we mobilize the full power that we can have as an economy, okay, and as a monetary sovereign, we can still compete.
Right.
We can still keep up. We can do technological marvels here. We can provide for our people here. We can make the Green New Deal transition, which we have to do anyway. In the process, we can provide full employment for our people and stability for this country. And we can get rid of the meanness that we see now. We can get rid of the sense of victimhood that we see now. We can get rid of the oppression that we see now.
Yes.
We don't even have to use too many new techniques. We've done wonders here ourselves in terms of rapid industrialization. We did wonders during the 1940s, during the Second World War, and wonders during the post-war period. And we can respond again. We just have to put aside the neoliberal modes of thought, go back to more traditional American mixed economy ideas, where corporations are placed, okay, in service to the people. And where we care about doing things that are in the interest of most people and that are for the public purpose. Okay, if we can do that, we can move forward very, very rapidly and collaboratively with other nations in the international system. It is time to turn away from war. It is time to turn inward, okay, to our country. It is time to build, okay, our economic strength. And it's time to use the paradigm, okay, of MMT to get us where we all need to go, to a more just, a more fair, and a more prosperous, and a more equal society, which collaborates with other society in bettering not only our own state, but their state as well. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And that's what I am hoping to facilitate. I'm trying to do that through these live streams, and I will continue to try to do it. Okay, I'll be back on Saturday night. I'll be taking off in the middle of the week to do other things. I'm sure you have plans, though, for the middle of the week, Dee?
Yes. Madeline most likely will be on tomorrow night, Wednesday night. And then I have Hashmed Thursday night.
Okay. So that will be great. And I will be back on, okay, on Saturday night.
Yes.
And have some more exciting things for you then, I hope.
Oh, I'm sure you will. There's just too much going on.
There's too much going on. As John B. says, they need to be persuaded that a broad overview knowledge will greatly enhance the daily commentary. For the sake of their nation, they must grasp the macro nettle. They are clever enough to do it. Now, I agree with you, John. There are some first-class minds there, and they are clever enough to do it. Hopefully, we'll be able to persuade them to take the relatively small amount of time it will take to grasp the basics of MMT so that they can stop making stupid statements when it comes to the deficits and the debts. Okay, and when it comes to foreign trade, because if they don't understand the sectoral financial balances models, they don't and can't understand foreign trade. I want once again to mention my book, Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs Balanced Budgets? That book is on sale at Amazon. It's a Kindle book. It goes for $9.99. The book will open your eyes to the relationship between trade deficits, okay, and budget deficits, and how we need to plan for both of them in the context of a framework that develops the idea, okay, of the public purpose. That framework is very important because we all need to work for the public purpose. That is, I think, the final purpose of our government, is to work for public purpose and not for private gain. And with that, I'm going to say good night.
Good night, Joe. Good night, Bonnie.
Good night. Great show.
Thank you.
Okay, and good night, everyone. And I'll see you again on Saturday, and Dee will be filling out the rest of the week.
Right. And
Some
if
really
you get a
great-
chance, please visit Joe's Patreon. Patreon.com, Joe_Firestone.
Oh, thank you, Dee.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate that. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night. Sleep tight.
Yeah.
Peace to the world, right?
Yes.
Yeah. John B. mentions Michael Hudson's super imperialism opened my eyes to the economic predation of the United States. Yes, that's a brilliant book, and he continues to write books that are brilliant as well. And we'll occasionally have some programs where we get into his stuff, okay, as well. And don't forget that Michael Hudson is an MMTer also, even though he transcends MMT in many ways. So good night all again.